That new executive order that will make it easier to hire and fire some federal employees will give agencies until January 19th to officially reclassify Schedule F positions. Jeff Neal's former Chief Human Capital Officer at the Department of Homeland Security. He's chairman of the National Academy of Public Administration. Ron Sanders is former Chief Human Capital Officer at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and now former chair of the Federal Salary Council. He's staff director at the Florida Center for Cybersecurity at the University of South Florida. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me. Ron, I start with you. You write today this: on its surface, the president's executive order purports to serve a legitimate and laudable purpose, that is, to hold career federal employees more accountable for their performance. However, it's clear the executive order is nothing more than a smokescreen for what is clearly an attempt to require the political loyalty of those who advise the president, or failing that, to enable their removal with little, if any, due process. Who'd you write that to, Ron, and why?
So, Francis, your sources are great because you've obviously gotten your hands on my letter of resignation. Effective this morning, I resigned as chair of the Federal Salary Council for the reasons articulated on the screen. That happened to be a passage in my letter. And this is a matter of personal conscience. The Federal Salary Council is an obscure body, and its chair is an obscure position. It is a presidential appointment, but as you indicated, I've resigned effective this morning because of the Schedule F executive order. In my humble opinion, it's a very sharp two-edged sword. On one hand, it purports to hold federal employees more accountable, a laudable subject if that were the case, but there are a number of reasons to be suspect of it, and we can talk about that. The other very sharp edge of this sword is it gives agency heads a chance to appoint political appointees, literally a massive burrowing in effort. And so I worry about both of those, especially given the timing of this executive order. And as a matter of conscience, I just couldn't be part of it.
Jeff Neal, welcome. Correspondent wrote to me this weekend that this should be called Schedule FU. You titled a blog post last week, White House drops an F-bomb on the career civil service. And you wrote this as well: it's the most direct assault on the career civil service since the passage of the Pendleton Act in 1883. Why so?
Well, Francis, it's because of exactly what Ron said. It's purporting to be something that addresses the problems with getting rid of poor performers. But the reality is that everything about it is done in a way that really is creating a new class of political appointees. And it could be tens of thousands or literally even hundreds of thousands when you look at the executive order and the definition of policy making or policy advocating positions. Policy advocating is a loophole you could drive a fleet of Mack trucks through. So what it's doing is it's creating tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of political appointees. And I don't know anybody who's realistically looking at the federal workforce who says what we need is to increase the number of political appointees tenfold or 20-fold. It's just so blatantly, nakedly political that I think you've seen from people who have a lot of different opinions about the federal workforce, almost universal disgust with this particular executive order. It's just simply undoing 137 years of merit-based civil service, and that's where I think it's really a devastating attack.
We'll talk about the response if we have time, but I note this passage and call your attention to it, gentlemen, in the guidance that Michael Regas put out on Friday. The executive order, he writes, directs each agency head to review positions within his or her agency and identify those positions appropriately categorized as confidential policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating, and then petition OPM to place those positions in Schedule F. Gentlemen, from your experience as Chicos, what if a Chico at an agency does nothing or responds, "We didn't find any"? Ron, you go first, please.
Well, I have to tell you, I worry about that because that, in many respects, legitimizes the purpose of the executive order. You want a responsive career civil service. And if a career civil servant disagrees with the policy of a president, not just the president, any president, there are certain appropriate things that he or she can do. But slow rolling it, going underground, again, to me, that just makes the reason for the executive order appropriate. You want career civil servants to be able to speak truth to power. And let me make a point here, Francis. The executive order focuses on policy advising, policy making, policy advocating positions. Look, political appointees make policy. They make the decisions. Career civil servants are supposed to give them their best advice, but they always have the prerogative of ignoring that advice. And this executive order puts them all in one basket and says, we don't care what that advice is, it's your fault, not ours, for making that policy decision. And that troubles me a great deal.
Jeff, that's quite a conundrum that Ron describes. Do you see it the same way?
I see it the same way to a degree, but when I look at this and look at how it was done with really very little work, very few people involved in actually writing this executive order, a lot of the background work that you would normally see done in a major policy that would affect tens of thousands of employees wasn't done. So the chicos who are going to be asked to implement this have a lot of background work that needs to be done that really is going to take months. And I don't know if they're going to be able to do it by the January 19th deadline in the executive order. Normally when you do something like this, you would do enough prep work up front that you would have a good idea exactly how many employees are going to be affected. But nobody really knows that right now. So in a department the size of the Department of Homeland Security, for example, with almost 200,000 career employees, you could easily have 10 or 20,000 people covered by this. And going through that number of job descriptions, looking at who they report to, what kind of work they do, and all of this type of thing that has to be done, you really can't do quickly. So I wouldn't call it slow rolling it. I would call it trying to actually implement it in a way that is legal, consistent with the executive order, and would stand up in court, and that you could actually explain when inevitably you get called to the Hill to testify about it. And I wouldn't want to go testify about something and say, yeah, I was given an order to do this, and so I just ran as fast as I could to do it and didn't pay attention to the niceties of civil procedure and didn't do it right. So I think doing this thing is going to take some time. I don't think it's going to get done by January 19th. And depending on what happens next week, I think we have some event going on Tuesday next week. Depending on what happens next week, it might get slowed down even more.
Jeff Neal, Ron Sanders, a lot more I'd love to cover, but we're out of time. Thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Francis.